Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, let's remove all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. Now let's go ahead and use a pry bar. We're going to carefully get in between the caliper and the outer pad, and what I'm essentially going to do is just gently pry, and I want to try pushing in the piston as far as I can. Put this in there. Now let's move along to our caliper slider bolts. You're going to find 2 13mm headed bolts. There's one up here and there's one located down here. Go ahead and remove the pair. That one's nice and loose. I'll leave it in there. The next thing you want to do is inspect your caliper. Make sure you don't see any fluid along this area right here. If you do, it's more than likely brake fluid, in which case you'd have to replace the caliper. This one looks good, so I'll set it aside. When I do this, typically it's a good idea to go ahead and hang it in some way. You want to make sure you're not putting any pressure on your flex hose. Now let's go ahead and get our brake pads out of here. Once you have all that out of the way, let's continue on to our 2 caliper bracket bolts. You'll find one here and one right there. Use a 21mm to remove the pair. Set your bracket aside. Next, I'm going to take one of my lug nuts. I'm just going to start it on here, just a couple threads. After that, we want to break the rotor free. Typically, you can just grab onto them, pull them right off. If you can't, let's give it a loving bonk along this area with the hammer. There we are. Remove your rotor. Now that we have the rotor off of there, the next thing we want to do is continue on by cleaning up the hub mating surface, essentially all the areas that the rotor is going to sit against. Now let's go ahead and put some copper never sees on our mating surface. Time to install the rotor. I always put one of my lug nuts on here. It's just going to hold the rotor so it can't flop around on us while we continue. Now it's going to be time to start preparing our caliper bracket. To do this, we're going to go ahead and remove our 2 caliper slider pins. Just go ahead and grab onto that slider. We're going to give it a little tug. Try to grab onto the boot and remove it from the caliper bracket. Once you have that off of there, we're also going to remove the boot from the caliper slider itself. Let's go ahead and rest this down on the bench. Carefully pull it down, remove the slider. After that, you just want to inspect the boots. Make sure they're still soft and pliable and they're not worn or torn in any way. Assuming it looks good, we'll do the same to the other side. Now we can continue on to removing the caliper bracket tins. You're going to find 4 of these, one on each corner. One here, here, and the same on the other side. To remove these, I just carefully get underneath one of the corners. Generally, they just pop right out of there. Do the same to all. Now the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and clean up our caliper bracket. We want to make sure we clean out both of our caliper slider ports. If you were to look inside there, you're probably going to see some goo or some gunk. I always just use a little bit of parts cleaner. We'll spray it right inside. Let it sit for a second to do its job. After that, I'm going to use a bore brush. Just come right in the center here and go ahead and wipe out any grease that's inside. Give that a rinse. Now you want to take a peek inside, make sure it's clean and free of any debris. Assuming it looks good, go ahead and do the same on the other side. Now once you have both your slider ports clean, let's continue on to the outer aspect of these. If you were to look along the caliper bracket, you can see where there's a little bezel coming across this area here. That's essentially where the boot's going to ride. It needs to be clean and free of any debris. That way there it's going to keep all the moisture and debris out of the port. Just go ahead and scrape that down a little bit, make sure there isn't anything there. Now once we have both of those done, let's continue on to those 4 corners that we removed our tins from. Just go ahead and scrape those down to remove any large areas. After you have it scraped, continue on with a nice brush and just clean it up fully. Once you have all 4 corners clean, let's continue on to those slider boots. Now for these, typically I just use a nice rag. I'm going to go ahead and try to twist this up a little bit. We'll push it right on through there. Now once you have it through, we're just going to go ahead and roll it around on the rag on the inside there. Go ahead and have a peek, make sure it's nice and clean. Assuming it looks good, do the same to the other one. Now once you've cleaned the boots, we're going to move along to cleaning up our caliper slider pins. You want to make sure that you clean down the entire shaft area of the pin. You can tell that there's a lot of debris and goo on this one right here. We're going to go ahead and clean that off and reapply brand new. But we also want to pay attention up inside this area right here. There's another one of those grooves where that caliper slider boot's supposed to be. You need to make sure you clean out any of the dirt or debris in this area as well. I'm going to go ahead and clean down both of these slider pins so we can continue. Alright, I have my caliper slider pin cleaned up here. Let's continue on with a little high temperature caliper grease. We're going to make sure we coat that entire shaft, so this is going to be nice and lubricated. Once the shaft's completely lubricated, let's continue on up and into the groove area that I was talking to you about. This is going to help keep moisture out of the area. Now I'm just going to take one of my caliper slider boots, we'll slide it right over, put it in position, and then I always just kind of twist it a little bit just to work that grease in there. Let's take a little bit more caliper grease and we're just going to go right along the port where it's going to be. Just a tiny bit inside the hole, but then we also want to make sure we get along that outer portion as well. Now we'll just go ahead and slide that right in. Work it around a little bit. Make sure it functions properly without any restriction. And then do the same to the other. Now that we have both slider pins done, let's continue on to lubricating those 4 corners on the bracket that we cleaned up. Next, we're going to continue on to our caliper bracket tins. Looking at these tins, you're going to be able to tell that some of them look a little different than others. What you're going to find is that down along one aspect, you're going to have kind of like a longer little flippy-do here. Then you have the other one that's right up there. If you were to look at the back side of it, which is going to be the area that it clips onto the caliper bracket, you're going to see that you have a tiny little edge here and then a larger one along this edge. The areas that we want to pay attention to are the area with the larger flippy-do, which is going to be facing down essentially, and then also the larger little clip that clips onto the bracket itself. That's going to be facing out and away from the rotor. So for this one, I'm just going to go ahead and take it, and we'll slide it right into position. Slip it on there, and then of course try to give it a little wiggle just to make sure it's nice and secure. All right, let's get over to the vehicle. Let's go ahead and take that caliper bracket. We're going to get it right into position. After that, we'll take both of our caliper bracket bolts with a little bit of red thread locker. We can start these in, then we'll tighten them up and torque them to manufacturer's specification. Let's torque this to 125 foot-pounds. Okay, now it's going to be time to install our brake pads. Pay attention to this area along here. You're going to find a wear indicator. You want to have one wear indicator on the inner pad facing down. Let's go ahead and take this. We'll slide it into position into the caliper bracket. Now when you put in your brake pads, you want to make sure that you don't have to hammer them in. They should be able to flow around freely just like this. If you have to hammer it in there, more than likely you didn't clean up the bracket enough. Put this in there. Next, we're going to move along to talking about the caliper itself. We're going to want to go ahead and squeeze in this piston as far as we can. So I'll just use my caliper tool here. Slide it right into the piston. Start squeezing this in. Once your caliper piston is fully depressed down into the caliper, we're going to continue on with a little bit more of that high temperature grease. And essentially I just want to go right along the caliper piston. And then we're also going to go along each of these ears. This is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Let's go ahead and grab onto that caliper. We'll slide it in position. We want to pay attention to the caliper sliders, make sure that it fits on there. We're going to go ahead and slide this right over the pads and put it in here. Once that's situated, let's continue on with our caliper slider bolts here. Go ahead and bottom those out. Once you have both of these bolts snugged, go ahead and torque each of them to 26 foot-pounds. All right, let's go ahead and get this lug nut off of here so we can grab the wheel. Now we can put the wheel on. At this point, we're going to start on all of our lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we can torque each of the lug nuts in a crisscross manner to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we got our brakes back together. What's left to do now? Now typically you're going to want to make sure you do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. After that, make sure you go ahead and pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Double check your master cylinder to make sure you're full of brake fluid. If it's low, add a little bit of .3 brake fluid. Other than that, take it for a road test, make sure you don't hear any funny noises. Thanks for watching.